Hello, my name's Yusuf Rasul. I am an undergraduate psychology student at the University of Leeds, having just finished a placement year working in a clinical psychology service. So, a little bit about why I chose to do the placement. So, prior to starting psychology at the University of Leeds, I had worked as a teaching assistant in a special needs school. And so from there, I was kind of between educational psychology and clinical psychology. I wasn't really too sure which avenue I wanted to go down, but I was quite certain that I wanted to go down one of these two. And I knew a little bit about the challenges and how competitive these professions are to get into, but obviously without the exposure and experience of what the professions are, it's difficult to know which one you prefer to go into. So when this opportunity arose at the beginning of the second year, when we were told about these clinical psychology placements, I was just very interested, and so I applied for it. And I think within a couple of weeks, it was like February time, I got the interview. I had the interview, and then a couple of days later, I got a call back saying that they'd offered me a place for the placement. And so it was fantastic, and there was very little that I had to do. The career service, they did most of the paperwork, I believe. I think I just had to change some details on my student finance, but after outside of that, there was really nothing much to do. And so I got into the placement. I was working. So I had two supervisors. So I was working in an inpatient service for people with learning disabilities. I'd also worked in a community service for people with learning disabilities, and then towards the end of my placement, I was working in a gender identity service for adults based in Leeds as well. In terms of the work itself, so there's kind of three components of my placement. So one was attending lots of meetings. I think within the first month, I think my stamina for meetings had really increased because it was a bit tricky to get straight into clinical or clerical work. So attending meetings was really what I was doing for the most part up until Christmas. But it was a great way to gain exposure to the NHS, to clinical services, and to psychology. And to meet people and hear the discussions, the contemporary issues, and just to get acclimatized with the whole kind of state of psychology and the state of the NHS. So it was very interesting in that sense. Secondly was shadowing. So I did some shadowing of clinical psychologists, of speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, nurses, psychiatrists as well. I think that's about it. But within that, it was very much about being proactive and asking if I could get involved in any kind of shadowing. So I was very fortunate in my position. I was able to sit in on some therapy sessions, which isn't typical for placement students, but I was in a position where I could sit in some therapy sessions. So that was really, really eye-opening to see firsthand the work that a clinical psychologist does in that therapeutic context, and to see the effect that it has on people. It's really quite amazing. And outside of this placement, I really would not have had that opportunity until I got into a position where I could do that, which is kind of that catch-22, because how do you get into that position with the necessary experience if you can't get the experience in the first place? And I think that's one of the the benefits of doing this kind of placement. And finally, the third part of the placement was to do with like audits, research work, and data analysis. So I learnt very quickly that if you're in NHS, but I think more widely, if you know how to use Excel and you know how to make some charts and you know how to put it on a PowerPoint presentation, employers will love you. So I did some of that. I did some quite a big re-audit, although I didn't get to finish it. I did quite a bit of data analysis for, so you have positive behavior support, PBS, which which is something that is used quite a lot in psychology, particularly for people with learning disabilities. So I was doing quite a lot of the data analysis around that to kind of map service users' behaviours and how can that inform the interventions for them. And then also there's the research. So I'm still finishing off my research project, which we're hopefully looking to get for publication. But that depends on the on whatever placement you might do. So in my case, it was looking at the last 13 years of admissions to this inpatient service, and looking at the trends, correlations, and just seeing how that matches with government initiatives and the national agendas for reducing admissions. So in terms of the benefits, I mentioned earlier about being able to acclimatise to the NHS kind of organisation, which is paramount if you want to go into clinical psychology training, because most of the time you'll be working in an NHS. I think another huge benefit there is to the placement is that you have regular supervision with a clinical psychologist. If I was asked prior to the placement, what does supervision to you mean? I wouldn't know. I really wouldn't know. But when you're on this placement and as you progress, hopefully as a psychologist, you'll realise how important supervision is, because it's that opportunity for you to sit down with hopefully someone like a manager or someone senior to you, and you can learn from them, you can reflect with them, or you can speak about your job, kind of more operationally speaking. But as a placement student, those supervisions were really a fantastic forum for me to kind of hear the candid thoughts and the reflections of the clinical psychologist, to ask questions of my own, to learn, and really to develop within those spaces, because as a placement student, you don't really have the constraints of being an employee. If you're an employee, you're expected to do certain things. You're expected to be in at certain times, be out at certain times, to do certain works by certain deadlines. Now, that applies to a certain degree for placement students, but I think in our position, in my position, I was very fortunate not to be overburdened with those constraints. I could be very free in terms of pursuing opportunities rather than having to hold myself back to certain things. And in terms of just that exposure, I like to think of it in terms of when I was in my first couple of years of the undergraduate, I would go to the careers talks, and there I'd see a clinical psychologist maybe for half an hour out of a 3-hour presentation. And that's once a year, twice, maybe 3 times if you go every year. But that exposure is just that. And to meet and speak with a clinical psychologist outside of that, if you don't have the connections, it's very difficult. And so for me to be able to have that opportunity to speak with and listen to clinical psychologists virtually every day of the working week is really just an incredible way of developing yourself, understanding what psychology is, what clinical psychologist, whether you fit into that, whether it's for you, etc. So that was absolutely fantastic. And the final benefit, I would say, of the placement has to do with opening doors. So not only do you get to meet do you spend a significant amount of time with your clinical psychologist supervisor, but you also get to meet a whole lot of other people working in the multidisciplinary teams. So be it nurses, psychiatrists, occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, etc., etc. And so that really branches out your network and perhaps your resources for going forwards. How do you progress within the profession that you're looking into? So finally, what I would say to another student encourage them to think about taking a placement. So in terms of this placement specifically, in terms of this placement specifically, if you're vaguely interested in clinical psychology, I think it's an absolute must to do this placement, because to get this quality of experience outside of a placement like this, to get this quality as well as the freedom to navigate and shape your experience as you feel you need, is very, very difficult. Perhaps the closest position to this would be an assistant psychologist post, which is extremely competitive to get into, and without this kind of experience in the first place, it's even more difficult to get into those. So it's an absolutely incredible initiative. It's so readily accessible for Leeds Uni students, and this is not the case for the majority of undergraduate psychology students. So if you're vaguely interested in clinical psychology, definitely at least put an application for this. More widely speaking, in terms of placements, I think you will notice a huge difference between students who've gone on placement and who haven't gone on placement, because especially if you've gone to school and you've gone straight into university, when you don't have this experience of working out or being outside of this kind of educational context, it's difficult to really have perspective on at a personal level, but also at a professional level. So taking a placement it really makes a huge difference for a lot of people, and I mean, I know the statistics to show that on average students who go on who take a placement have return with higher grades on their course. So yeah, that's me speaking about my placement. Thank you very much for listening. I wish you all the best, and take care. Thank you.